came that night. The kind that splits your life into before and after. My wife. And another voice. Male. Familiar, but not in a good way. I shouldn't have listened. I know that. But I did. Can you believe he still has no idea about anything? 2 kids. All his. Still paying for private school like a good little mule. He thinks they look like him. It's kind of adorable, really. Your mom's a saint for helping out, by the way. She always said he wasn't sharp enough to see the truth. That moment, let me tell you, wasn't rage. Not at first. It was silence. The kind that sits in your chest and hollows you out with a spoon. I didn't barge in. Didn't yell. I walked away like a ghost in my own house, down to the garage where I kept the old camping cooler full of beer. Sat on the concrete floor, cracked one open, and tried to convince myself I'd heard it wrong. Over the next week, I played the part, husband, father, provider. I smiled through it. I hugged my kids a little tighter. Watched the way she looked past me when I spoke. Noticed how my mother acted like the head of some secret committee every time she came over. Funny how things stand out when your eyes finally open. I ran the DNA test a few days later. 1 for each child. Sent him off like it was nothing. While I waited, I got to work. I liquidated everything I could without raising eyebrows: stock accounts, the investment property I'd bought before the marriage, the savings I'd tucked away in a separate trust under my sister's name. I made it look like a restructuring for a new job offer. Even had my lawyer draw up a resignation letter from the firm. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I wanted clean. The results came in on a Wednesday. 0% match for both kids. You ever been punched without seeing the fist? That's what it felt like. Air gone. Heart quiet. But after a minute, something in me clicked into place, like finding the last piece of a puzzle I didn't know I'd been solving for years. Thanksgiving was the next day. I showed up early. Set the table myself. My wife thought I was making some grand gesture. My mother hovered, saying the roast needed more salt. Once everyone was seated, I stood, raised my glass, and thanked them for everything: the love, the laughter, the support. Then I pulled out the DNA test results, laid them on the table beside the cranberry sauce, and said, I know. Everything. The look on her face? The silence from my mother? Worth more than all the years they stole from me. Disappearing isn't as hard as people think. Especially when no one's really looking for you. Just the version of you that kept the lights on and never asked questions. I didn't leave a note. Didn't take much more than a duffel bag, my laptop, and a few burner phones. The rest? Let her have it. The house, the cars, even the stupid espresso machine I never learned to use. Let her sit in that big house and try to explain why the husband she swore was so predictable suddenly vanished like smoke. I drove west with no real plan except this: build something that couldn't be taken from me. That first year was brutal. Motel rooms. Cold coffee. Startup pitches over Zoom in my car. I used every contact I'd built during my quiet years: colleagues, old college buddies, even a guy I met once in a customs line who turned out to run a seed fund in Seattle. I cashed in every chip, not because I was desperate, but because I was free. When you've already lost everything, risk stops being scary. I started small. App development, back-end systems, automation tools for mom-and-pop shops that couldn't afford enterprise pricing. My code ran lean, fast, and ugly, but it worked. And when something works, word spreads. I slept 5 hours a night, max 8 whatever I could microwave. I was hungry in more ways than one. Year 2, I had my first 6-figure deal. Year 3, I sold my first startup to a mid-tier VC firm in Austin. I didn't celebrate. I reinvested every penny. Bought myself a decent place, nothing flashy. Just clean walls and a quiet view. I didn't need a mansion. I needed runway. And I ran. The funny thing about success is that people start remembering your name real fast. The same people who wouldn't take my calls 5 years earlier were suddenly inviting me to fireside chats and exclusive retreats. I went to a few, wore a cheap watch, and let them underestimate me. People love to talk when they think you're harmless. By year 8, I was on my 4th company. AI logistics optimization. Boring to most, but not to the right buyers. That one turned me into a multi-millionaire overnight. I kept building. I didn't need yachts or supercars. I needed freedom. And that kind of freedom costs more than people realize. Somewhere around year 12, I hit billionaire status. Quietly. No press release. No ribbon cutting. My name wasn't even on the official company filings. But it was mine. Every inch of it. And yet, every so often, I'd pull up the local paper from back home. Just to check. The town hadn't changed much. Same Main Street. Same gossip. And, yes, same family Thanksgiving at my old house. She still lived there. My mother, too. They converted my old office into a craft room, apparently. The kids? Teenagers now. Smart, successful. I kept tabs. They were good kids. Not mine. But still, kids. I didn't blame them. But I remembered. And one day, I decided it was time to go home. You'd be amazed how fast a small town forgets you, until they think they might need you. I pulled into town on a crisp October morning, the kind that smells like burning leaves and faint regret. The sun hadn't fully climbed the sky, and the roads still had that sleepy feel, like they were just waking up and trying to remember how to carry secrets. I drove the long way in, past the old mill, the community college, and the gas station that hadn't changed its coffee filter since Bush was in office. Nothing had changed. Well, almost nothing. Main Street had a new coffee shop where the hardware store used to be, run by some tattooed guy who brewed espresso like it was holy water. I stepped inside wearing jeans, a Henley, and a pair of boots that looked like they'd seen better days. The kind of outfit that said contractor more than capitalist. I ordered a black coffee, tipped big, and sat by the window. That's when it started. A few familiar eyes lingered a little too long. A woman I hadn't seen in years, some high school classmate who once called me forgettable, squinted like she recognized me but couldn't quite place where from. I sipped my coffee. Said nothing. Didn't take long before the whispers began. By lunch, I drove up to the property I'd already purchased 2 months earlier under a shell company. 15 acres just north of town with a lake, a winding drive, and enough privacy to raise eyebrows. When folks saw the construction crews roll in, building what looked like a modern estate, they assumed it was some tech billionaire relocating from the West Coast. And technically, they weren't wrong. I waited a week. Let the town speculate. Then, I showed up to the annual fall festival like I hadn't just detonated a 15-year absence. I walked through the gates with my sleeves rolled up and my hands in my pockets. People froze. Like ghosts had started talking. Conversation stalled. Kids stopped in mid-step, staring up at the man they thought was long gone. Some looked confused. Others nervous. But she? She wasn't there yet. Of course not. She always arrived fashionably late. Loved an entrance. I remembered that. My mother was, though, holding court by the pie stand, wearing the same brand of judgment she'd worn for decades. Her eyes locked onto me like a hawk spotting a mouse. And for a flicker of a second, just one little second, she looked afraid. That's when I knew I still had power. And I hadn't even spoken yet. Then she showed up. Late, as expected. Flawless, as always. Makeup just enough to say, I woke up like this, and heels too expensive for a festival. She was hanging off the arm of some guy in khakis, probably the same flavor she always liked. Beige. Safe. Dull enough not to notice things. When she saw me, she stopped walking. He asked something. I couldn't hear, but she didn't answer. Just stared. I didn't wave. Didn't smile. Just tilted my head like I was studying a painting I'd seen before but now noticed something new in. Then I turned and kept walking. Let her wonder. Let them all wonder. Later that week, I made my move. Bought the old community center. Renovated the library. Donated $500,000 to the high school STEM program, in cash, no press release. I hadn't been back to the house since the day I walked out, DNA results still fluttering beside the turkey and stuffing like awkward dinner guests no one invited. You'd think they'd have moved by now. But no, she stayed. That house was always more hers than mine anyway. I just paid for it. Pulled up on a Wednesday afternoon. Sky gray, wind sharp, the kind of weather that makes folks reach for sweaters and small talk. Her car was there. Same one I'd helped her pick out. Still ran, though I imagined by now she'd used up every ounce of charm with the dealership service department. I stood at the edge of the driveway for a minute. Not nervous. Just curious. 15 years. Not a single phone call. Not a message. Not even a carrier pigeon. That's what struck me the most, how comfortable they were in the silence. Like I was never coming back. I walked up the porch steps. Same creak on the third one. That stupid little owl statue still sat on the banister. Crooked like always. I knocked. Footsteps. Then the door opened. And there she was. Older, of course, but in that way where time had been kind to her face and unkind to her spirit. Her eyes held less sparkle, more calculation. The same woman, but something had withered behind the smile. She didn't say my name. Just stared like she was trying to decide if she was hallucinating or if karma had finally rolled back into town in a pair of boots and a calm demeanor. "Fee," I asked. "Or should I come back with lawyers?" Her jaw tensed. You've got some nerve. I've got exactly what I need, I said, stepping past her into the house. Same kitchen, different furniture, less heart. I walked in like I'd never left, because really, I hadn't, not in my mind. That place was frozen in amber, and I was the mosquito with receipts. She followed, arms crossed. What do you want? Clarity, I said, setting my phone on the counter and pressing record without hiding it. 15 years of it. You're not the father, she snapped. You already know that. You made that very clear when you dumped their paternity tests between the mashed potatoes and the pumpkin pie. But I was their dad, I said, voice steady. Until I wasn't. So remind me, who was the father? Because the math still doesn't add up. She hesitated. Let me guess, I continued. It wasn't just one guy, and it wasn't an accident. What you did, this wasn't a mistake. It was a campaign. She didn't deny it. Just sat down at the table and looked away. I followed her gaze. Toward the mantel. Photos of the kids. Older now. Prom night. Graduation. Family cookouts. No pictures of me. Like I'd been airbrushed out of my own life. You got what you wanted, she said finally. You always wanted to disappear. I just helped you. I leaned forward. No. You disappeared me. I disappeared on my terms. Silence stretched between us. She wouldn't meet my eyes. So I stood. Walked to the fridge. Still had that humming rattle I used to promise to fix. You really gonna stand there like you didn't ruin lives? She asked, voice rising. You think walking back in with a bank account gives you the high ground? No, I said. But it gives me options. You'd think walking back into town after 15 years would be the hardest part. It wasn't. It was seeing them. The kids. Well, her kids, biologically speaking. Mine only in memories and old home videos I couldn't bring myself to delete for a decade. They were grown now. I'd kept tabs from a distance. Not obsessively, just enough. Old habits die hard when you've once known how it feels to tuck them in at night. Ben was in college now, studying environmental science, of all things. Kid used to cry when his goldfish died. Go figure. And Emma? High school senior. Art shows. Student council. She had the same laugh she did when she was 5 and spilled grape juice on my khakis right before a wedding. And I still remembered how they looked at me back then like I could fix anything. Funny how the past doesn't ask your permission to keep playing reruns in your head. Anyway, there was a street fair in town. One of those forced smile, overpriced lemonade deals the local chamber of commerce throws to pretend everything's fine. I knew they'd be there. Everyone was. And I didn't dress to stand out. Wore a hoodie, ball cap. The former dad who moved to Colorado starter kit. I saw them near the bookstore, laughing about something. No mom in sight. No stepdad either. Just them. My stomach tightened like a knot remembering how it felt to carry them both through the rain one Halloween when the sky opened up halfway through trick-or-treating. I stepped closer. They didn't notice at first. Why would they? Then Ben looked up. Froze. Like he saw something he'd once dreamt about, but never expected to see in daylight. Emma followed his gaze. Her face changed slower. Confusion first, then recognition. Then something I hadn't seen since they were little. Hope. Hi, I said. Real simple. Like I hadn't missed over half their lives. Ben took a step forward. Are you? I am, I nodded. Didn't expect to see you both so soon. But I'm glad I did. Emma's arms were crossed, defensive. Why now? Good question, I said. Answer's not short, but it's honest. They waited. I gestured to a bench nearby. We sit, I'll talk. If you walk away, I won't follow. After a pause, they sat. I told them the story. Not everything, but enough. The overheard conversation. The DNA tests. The Thanksgiving bombshell. The silence after. I didn't blame their mother. Didn't insult her. Didn't even name names. Just laid it out straight. Ben was quiet, his eyes flickering between the ground and the skyline like he was trying to redraw his family tree in real time. Emma finally spoke. Why didn't you say goodbye? That one hit harder than I expected. Because I didn't want to lie to you, I said. And I wasn't strong enough to tell the truth without falling apart. They sat with that. Not angry. Just processing. Ben cleared his throat. So what now? You just back? I shrugged. Back in town, sure. Back in your lives? That's up to you. Emma tilted her head. You have a new family? No, I said softly. Never did. I always knew my mother had a knack for quiet manipulation. The kind of woman who could poison a well and convince you the water always tasted like that. But I didn't know how deep her roots went. After the reunion with Ben and Emma, I started asking questions, quietly. No confrontation, no fireworks. Just conversations. Coffee chats with old neighbors. Polite run-ins with local business owners. Hey, remember when? Here and there. And you'd be amazed what people let slip when they think you're just a ghost in jeans with a polite smile and deep pockets. Turns out, my departure wasn't just brushed under the rug. It was swept. Intentionally. Systematically. By people I'd once trusted. It started with the church. Pastor Whitcomb, old and balding, used to call me son and slap my back so hard it left echoes. After I left, he'd apparently told folks I'd had a breakdown. Said I'd run off. Couldn't handle the pressure of being a husband and father. Even got up in front of the congregation and prayed for the strength of the family left behind. Left behind. Like I was roadkill on the shoulder. Then there was my old boss at the credit union. Dale. The man whose roof I fixed after a storm for free. When people asked about me, he told them I'd embezzled money, ran off with a younger woman. Said the whole town should be glad I was gone. And this is where it gets rich. That story came from my mother. Yup. Nancy Harper, queen of casseroles, church bulletins, and passive-aggressive praise. She hadn't just looked the other way when my wife cheated. She'd actively helped smooth the path, covered for late nights, took the kids for weekends she claimed were so you two could reconnect, when in reality, it was so she could spend more time with the man she preferred her daughter-in-law be with. And when the DNA test came out, she spun that too. Told people I planted them to shame my wife. That I was spiraling. Unhinged. Said it was probably a midlife crisis and hinted I might have a problem with pills. I didn't even take Advil back then. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why would your own mother do that? Let's just say, she never liked that I didn't toe the line. Didn't marry the girl she'd picked. Didn't take over Dad's old insurance agency. Didn't ask her opinion before painting the living room. And when I married someone she could control, she made sure the leash was short. The worst part? She never once called. Never checked in. Never said, come home. So, naturally, I paid her a visit. She opened the door in that floral apron she always wore when she wanted to seem harmless. Her eyes widened. Just slightly. Well, she said. Look what the cat dragged in. I walked, Mom, I replied. Cats don't take credit for things they didn't earn. We had tea. It was tense. Polite. Like a knife in a linen napkin. I heard you've been busy, she said. You mean building an empire after being excommunicated by my own family? Yeah. Keeps me out of trouble. She smirked. Still dramatic, I see. I leaned back in the chair. I know what you did. She froze. Which part? All of it. She didn't deny it. Just stirred her tea like we were discussing the weather. Families do what's necessary, she said. No, I said. Snakes do. She looked up then. For the first time in years, I saw a flicker of something real. I'd spent 15 years letting them shape the story. Now it was my turn to hold the pen and the deed to half the town. See, when you've got money, people open doors. When you've got quiet money, they hand you the keys and don't ask questions. First move, I bought the old Preston textile mill. Not to tear it down, but to turn it into something new. A tech incubator. State-of-the-art workspace, free rent for local startups, and partnerships with the regional university. Of course, I didn't slap my name on it. That would have been too easy. Instead, I named it after my late father. The one person who taught me that silence can be dignity, not weakness. The Henry Harper Center for Innovation. People assumed it was just a philanthropic gesture. Humble roots, big return. They had no idea. I bought 3 more properties that month. The strip mall where my mother's church met. Bought. The event space where my ex-wife now coordinated community fundraisers. Bought. The golf course where her new husband, the beige one, I later learned his name was Todd, played every Saturday like it was religion. Bought. All of them under different LLCs, with clean paper trails and zero ties to me. Until I wanted there to be. Then I got personal. I started hiring. Quietly. A full scholarship program for underprivileged high schoolers. Check. A construction contract for a crew of laid-off locals who hadn't had steady work since I left. Check. A grant for Ben's university department, fully anonymous, of course. An art supply endowment in Emma's name, which just happened to fund the exact studio she used after school. One by one, I moved the chess pieces. And here's the kicker. I wasn't trying to ruin anyone. I was trying to rebuild what they broke, just without the rot. But some people, they can't handle that kind of change. Dale, the same old boss who claimed I ran off with embezzled funds, came crawling the minute he heard a mysterious investor was expanding operations in town. He walked into the meeting room, suit one size too tight, grin too wide. "Mr. Matthews, right?" he said, holding out his hand. I didn't take it. "Try again," I said. "That's the name on the LLC. But you and I both know who you're here to see." He blinked. Then his smile cracked just enough to show the panic behind it. "Harper." Bingo. He tried to recover, of course. Said he was just repeating what he'd heard back then, that he'd always admired my work ethic. I leaned in. "You helped bury me," I said. "Now you'll watch me rebuild this town on the bones of your gossip." Then I offered him a job. Not because he deserved it, but because nothing makes a man sweat like realizing the person he smeared is now signing his paychecks. He took it, of course. People always do when they realize pride doesn't pay the mortgage. By the end of the year, I'd quietly become the town's largest employer. People started connecting dots. Slowly. Some asked if I was back for revenge. I wasn't. I was back for redemption, just not for me. For the kids. For the people who always believed me but were too scared to say it. For the quiet workers who never had a voice in this place. But make no mistake, those who burned bridges didn't get rebuilt paths. It started with a letter. Certified mail. Fancy envelope. One of those gold seals that says, "I'm not messing around," even when the content inside screams desperation. My ex-wife was suing me. The official charge? Intentional interference with livelihood and community reputation. Unofficially? She didn't like the spotlight shifting. Didn't like the way people in town were starting to remember who I was and who she'd been while I wasn't looking. The lawsuit claimed that my return had caused emotional distress and created a hostile environment for her and her family, including her new husband, Beige Todd, whose real estate company happened to be losing deals left and right to, well, me. Her lawyer? None other than the smug, preening type who pronounces Esquire like it's part of a royal title. I remembered him from the old days, slick hair, crocodile grin, allergic to truth. I didn't flinch. I just called my own lawyer. A quiet guy named Vince who looked like a tax accountant, but fought in court like a caffeinated honey badger. Vince didn't talk much. He documented. And oh boy, did we have documentation. Before the hearing, Vince slid a folder across the table. "Everything we need," he said calmly. "Financial records, communications, testimonies, witnesses, a whole scrapbook of the 15 years they tried to erase you." I flipped through it. Emails from her to mutual friends during the early days of my disappearance, laughing about how I finally got out of her way. Social media posts with captions like "New chapter, no baggage." Even a journal entry we got from a storage unit auction, don't ask, where she detailed how Mom helped with the timing. He was too dumb to see it coming. And then there was the kicker. Bank statements. Showing transfers from my accounts during those final months, directly into a shared one between her and Todd. She was laundering my money into her future while smiling at me over burnt coffee in our kitchen. So yeah, when the judge called us in for the preliminary hearing, I came prepared. She sat across from me in her best courtroom dress. The one she used to wear to fundraisers when she needed to look relatable. Her lawyer started with the whole song and dance. How my return had upended the peace. How I had weaponized success. How the children, her children, were suffering confusion because of my calculated re-entry into their lives. I waited until he was done. Then I slid the folder to the judge. Didn't say a word. The judge, a stern woman who'd lived in town long enough to know every skeleton, read silently for a while. Her eyes didn't move much. But her jaw? It clenched just once. Then she looked at my ex and said, flatly, "Do you want to withdraw this before I make it very public?" Silence. She didn't answer. Just stared at the folder like it was leaking acid. The judge continued, "Because if you don't, I'll be forced to schedule a full hearing. Which means depositions, testimonies, witness lists. And by the time we're done, your name won't be in a headline, it'll be in a footnote." The lawyer tried to object. She raised her hand. "Counselor, I wasn't asking." And just like that, the case was dropped.